Welcome to Catalyze. I'm Sarah O'Carroll. I have with me Rob Gourley from the class of 18. Rob is a documentary producer, cinematographer, and editor. We asked the alumnus to join the show to share about how an opportunity with PBS Nova helped him make the decision to become a freelancer, as well as how he became one of the first videographers for the show Doug to the Rescue. He also shares an adorable story about tequila, which will make sense if you stick around until the end of the episode. Rob, thanks so much for speaking with me today.
Hi, Sarah. Thank you so much for having me on.
The last time I checked, you were a video producer for the LA Times. So can you share about that experience and what kind of inspired you to take the leap into freelance?
It was a really foundational experience for me. Every day I was constantly hopping from between like a lot of different projects that demanded like a lot of different styles. And, there's some of the projects were a little more cut and dry journalism pieces, but others that were more feature oriented kind of allowed me, it was still journalism, but I was able to bring a little bit more of a vision to it and a little bit more creativity to telling the story. And so, but I think like as I was there, like the longer that I was there, I realized that the projects that I looked to the most for inspiration and the projects that I most wanted to create eventually in my career, those weren't necessarily being done by people who were working at newspapers or at journalism outlets necessarily. They were producing by, in large part, people who were freelance. And I think one of the things that I started to see once I got into the industry was, even the longer form stories, the longer form documentary stories that are produced at newspapers are generally made by partnerships between newspapers and independent filmmakers or newspapers and, video centric, video production companies. And so I think once I started to see, obviously the work that video journalists do is incredibly important and there's a need for that. But I think the niche that it fills wasn't necessarily where I saw myself going long term. And I think I also wanted a little bit more ownership over my work. I started thinking about freelance earlier on. And then the question was like when to make the jump. It's been kind of a wild time to become a small business owner, but I'm really fortunate to have been able to make it work so far.
Right. To make that kind of decision in the middle of the pandemic must have been probably a little scary, or was it mostly just optimistic because you knew that the time was right to do something for yourself?
It was definitely really scary. And I actually, initially I didn't anticipate making that jump during the pandemic. I'd been thinking about it a little bit off and on, and it was just luck and happenstance that I ended up like having an opportunity to actually, for a moment, like step outside the paper and work on an external project. I was contacted by a production company that I had actually interned with in my time at Carolina. It was one of my Morehead-Cain SEP summers.
Miles O'Brien Productions?
Yes. Yeah. So Miles O'Brien is the science correspondent for the PBS NewsHour, and he runs a production company. It used to be out of Boston. When I interned with them, it was out of Boston. But they produce a lot of science focused content, and that's a bit of my forte. I really like that kind of content, and I had a chance to intern with him in college and had just kept that connection alive, and had kept reaching out and like talking with my friends there. They were looking at doing a Nova documentary about electric airplanes. And it just so happens that a lot of the companies who are doing that kind of work are in California. And they needed someone out here to do a lot of the filming for it, and to just kind of like work on shoots to kind of fulfill a lot of roles, including audio and lighting and filming. And so they reached out while I was at the paper, and they said, "Would you be available to do this and join us for a couple weeks of filming here and there?" And so this was something that I was really interested in. And obviously, it's a PBS Nova film, just an incredible opportunity to work on something like that. So I ended up, requesting to take a sabbatical from the paper to work on this project. And I think, what started as a sabbatical turned into a resignation and going freelance full time. I think having the chance to, I was really lucky to have a chance to just, take a step out of that door in a safe way. I could come back to the job. Like that was my plan at the start of it. But I think, once I took that step out, I saw that, for me at least, the grass really was greener. And, it's not it's not without its own, drawbacks, but just having a chance to step into the freelance world and work on a project that I like, that's in the style that I really wanted to be working on, like longer form documentary storytelling. I think it just made me realize that it was doable in the moment. And yeah, I made the jump.
Hmm. So, what are you curious about pursuing now? Are you thinking about any specific issues that you want to tackle, or even have a specific documentary in mind that, if you have the time and resources to do it, that you want to pursue?
Some of the stuff that I'm most interested in working on are stories that are really immersive for audiences. And I think, and what I mean by that is when people generally think of documentaries, a lot of the times when you watch a documentary on TV or even on a streaming service, there's generally like a lot of information. Like that's kind of like the typical model. There's like a lot of information, usually maybe like a narrator or a reporter leading someone through a story. And I think that, and it's packed with like a lot of statistics and relevant information. I think those documentaries have their place and they're really important. But I also see this need for documentaries that can really pull someone into someone else's experience and maybe convey information and emotion using some of the same language that's not really used in documentary, but maybe more so used in cinema. When you go in and you watch a film in a movie theater, you generally expect something, or you expect a very different experience than watching a documentary. And I think the fundamental language that's used between the two genres, generally it can differ a lot, it can differ a little, but I think there are more and more films coming out that are kind of exploring this style called cinema verite. um, and this style has been around for a while, but Honeyland would be a great example of like a recent well known film that's kind of in pursuit of that style of really immersing an audience member in someone else's experience and using that as a means to convey meaning, to convey information. And in terms of looking at the environment, it's kind of hard to find stories that do that sometimes. When you're talking about you know climate change, for example, something that often like an image that often comes to mind is glaciers melting. And while that's horrific that that's taking place, for the average person, it's hard to see how that connects into daily life. And it's hard to like watch clips of animals in the Arctic, or these processes that are very slowly, slow enough that it's hard to convey on screen. These processes are taking place, and it's just hard to really get these. In my opinion, it's hard to get these things to like really hit home with many people in the audience, just because it's hard to relate to these things. These things are abstract. They happen over longer periods of time. They're not really in your day to day life. And I think for me, like um, an area that I'm increasingly interested in focusing on that kind of deals with that is wildfires. I had a chance to cover a couple wildfires while I was at the LA Times, and the experience of being in that environment with the fire raging around you. It's one of the most visceral, like immediate examples that I could think of off the top of my head that that really shows like the impending crisis that we're all kind of starting to go through now, and that we will be experiencing in the next 10, 20, 30 years.
There is something so pressing about actually looking out your window and seeing an orange haze because a fire is just miles away, and that it doesn't feel so distant like a glacier melting, which few of us will probably get to go see, kind of thing. But something that's a bit more day to day and kind of in your face.
Absolutely. And I think for, especially for people who are out on the West Coast, last year we had a really awful set of fire complexes in Northern California where, in SF, in San Francisco, the sky was orange. Here where I live in Chico, out in rural California, there was a day where it rained ash, and the fires weren't even at our doorstep, but it just it clouds the air. There's like a haze whenever there are fires about, and it almost seeps into like every aspect of life. And I think Granted, someone on the East Coast might who or people who live in areas that aren't as prone to fire probably can't share that experience. But just knowing that like there's this intersection of of this like intense visceral fire and people coming together. There's like this intersection there that's really intense and immediate. And there are stories that take place, all around that, from preparing to during to like after, like the healing process. And there's so much there that's relatable and immediate and visceral, and that has the power to be immersive. And so like focusing on stories like that is something that like I'm really interested in working on in the future. And I also have a little bit of this kind of a wild idea for how to film it too.
Tell me about this.
So if anyone had a chance to see 1917 this past year and a half, it came out. It's filmed by one of my favorite directors of photography, Roger Deakins, and it was filmed, or it was presented, as if the whole entire movie was shot in one single take. So
Huh.
there's no cuts. There's no different shots. It is shot as if it's just the camera moving through the landscape, following the characters. And it by no means is the first movie to do this, but there's a lot of theory behind this, and I could talk at length about like why it works this way. But when you're presenting a film to an audience that contains such intense subject matter, and you don't include any breaks or any cuts for them to be able to really even blink, it becomes so immersive and so much more intense. It really doesn't even give the audience a chance to really even look away or like catch a breath. And it's really almost like relentless in a sense, even though there's no fast cuts. It's just like one long take. And I think, I don't know, like I've been trying to look into it, and there are reasons for this, but there aren't any documentaries that really take place in one cut that's like that, like that's really moving through a landscape that like develops characters, and um that takes you through a story like in that way. And so I've been thinking about like the intensity of wildfires, and like really trying to immerse an audience in the human experience around that to really convey what's going on. And I've been thinking about the idea of trying to do it in maybe even one take or several really long takes. And the work that would have to go into that is fairly immense. It's not as easy as just like going out and just filming for an hour with a camera. It would take a lot of prep work, and it would probably take a lot of tries before getting the right take. But I think like the thought of trying to create like a really immersive documentary in that way is like really interesting to me, and that's kind of something that's like pie in the sky that like I'm dreaming about. But maybe I'll have a chance to make that documentary at some point.
Hmm. And of course, now you're also working with natural disasters kinds of work with Doug to the Rescue, which I'd love to talk about next. Tell us where the idea for the show came from and why you got involved, why you wanted to get on board.
Yeah. So back when I was working on the Nova film, during the sabbatical and right after I went freelance, the other cinematographer that was working on that project had just pitched the show and gotten it approved for funding. And we started talking about it, and immediately caught my interest. The show originated when this cinematographer was in the Bahamas after Hurricane Dorian. He was there doing more or less like just general news coverage. And he ended up running into this guy named Doug, who was flying this really sophisticated drone for the purpose of rescuing animals that had been separated from their owners or that had been stranded after the storm, who were just basically left helpless on their own. And he immediately befriended him, and they started talking about the possibility of doing a bigger documentary project about Doug's work, just because it's so interesting. And they were able to pre-sell it through Curiosity Stream as one of their first original series. And the reason why it stood out to them was the same reason that I got really interested in it, is it's this, there are a lot of animal rescue shows out there. That concept isn't really new, but what makes Doug's show so different is there's this really interesting intersection of technology, that really has only become commercially available in the past couple years. There's a connection of that with all of these environmental issues. He's going in and rescuing animals after these events that are becoming more intense and more frequent because of climate change, and those topics are intersecting over this core mission of wanting to go and save the helpless, like rescue these helpless animals that, if left on their own, would perish. And so it's these interesting themes intersecting over a show that, at its core, has a lot of heart. It just so happened that the cinematographer who had pitched the show, who is an executive producer on the show, he was tied up in a lot of different projects that he had already committed himself to, and they needed people to kind of at the spur of the moment, hop on these trips after natural disasters, which we couldn't plan for. And so he said, would you be interested in working on this in a big way and like coming onto the project? He'd seen a little bit of my work, and we had a chance to work together, and he got to know me that way. Um, and he felt comfortable enough and like asked me to be a part of it, and I was absolutely on board, because at that point too, I was so early in my freelance career, like I had a lot of availability, and it just really worked out. And the first shoot that I went on was in Louisiana after Hurricane Laura. It had devastated this small city called Lake Charles, and there was a lot of news coverage about it. For the sake, Doug was debating whether or not going. We were trying to make sure that things would work out on the ground, and I think like really at the core of it, this was so early in the production process, and this is the first season of the show. There wasn't a formula or a template for determining like whether or not certain locations or certain events would work out for us, that Doug would have a lot of animals to rescue. Initially, it was a really small team that they sent to Louisiana because in their minds they were saying this might be a total wash. And there was funding, but it was the first season of the show. There wasn't like a huge budget for it. And so really for most of the time there, it was just me, one other producer, and Doug. And we were sent down for what initially, they said like maybe it'll be a couple days. We'll kind of feel it out and just kind of see from there. And what initially might have been only a couple days ended up turning into almost 2 weeks of like really long filming. And because the show hadn't been super established yet, I mean there were some things that we talked about going into it, but because there was so much blank canvas to work with, I had an opportunity to really bring my own style and vision into the making of of those episodes. And in Louisiana alone, we pulled out 2 episodes from that trip of the 6. And I was with them for other shoots too, but that was the first time that I was on the project, and I just felt so lucky to be working on a project that one had was going to be distributed, had had funding like that, but also be able to really have the creative freedom to like bring my own eye into it. And I feel like that's at a higher level, at a higher caliber, those opportunities are a lot more rare.
Yeah, well, especially after, as you said, you were hoping for more creative freedom at the LA Times, as wonderful as a first job that it was. And so to just less than a year later, essentially, to be working on this is just really exciting. And my last question is, what does the word tequila mean to you at a personal level?
On a personal level, tequila is my dog, which I my partner and I ended up rescuing him off of the show Doug to the Rescue, kind of spur of the moment. But we actually, he Tequila and I make an appearance on the show. I make a little cameo. But backing up a little bit more, my family, like I grew up with dogs. I grew up with rescue animals, and in my mind, I kind of knew at some point, that was going to happen. I was gonna try to adopt a dog. I just didn't know. I didn't know when that would be, and I thought it would be a lot further down the road. Um, but when I hopped onto this show, you're out there rescuing animals who are just so helpless, and all they want to do is to like have a home and to just love you and just to be loved. And it's one of the most pure expressions of love that I've ever experienced. And um, uh, do you want me to go into the backstory of how we found him?
Yes, please do.
um, so it was late, really late at night in Louisiana. Part of one of the quirks of the show is that for the drone to work, it uses an infrared camera. It has to fly at night. And so we would work long hours into the night, and at 3 or 4 a.m. we were wrapping up, and it had been like a really tiring night. We had filmed a lot. We had picked up a lot of cats and dogs, and Doug and I were driving back to pick up the producer who had been sitting with some of our equipment, and suddenly, like on the sidewalk as we're driving, this dog walks through the beam of light on the sidewalk. And Doug looked over at me and he said, "Should we rescue that dog?" And in my mind, we were like, "Oh, we're really tired. It's really late. We don't have a kennel for it." But we decided to go for it. He wanted to do it. Like the dog was right there. We wanted to at least give it a shot. And Tequila was really skittish at first, but clearly wanted to be friends. And he had gone at least 10 days without, scavenging for food and water on the street. Like he was really hungry, and we were able to eventually get him over and like put a leash on him. And it took a while to coax him in and get him into the car. And we didn't have a kennel because we were working with a group there that had all of that equipment, and they had already gone back to the shelter. And so we, the only option was for Tequila to sit in the back of the car with me. And at that point, he didn't have his name, but in my mind, this dog had just been through probably what was one of the worst experiences of its life, where it had been on the streets through a hurricane, and then had to scavenge for food for 10 days and find water. After an experience like that, I would be really angry. But Tequila, riding all the way back to the shelter in the car, like he just put his head on my shoulder, and he just gave me a hug just the whole way back. And in that moment, it just became clear, like, he went through all of that ordeal and was just still at the end of the day just so loving and sweet and kind, and it just broke my heart wide open. I don't I don't think I could not adopt him at that point.
If only you had known at the time of leaving your job that not only would you be working on this cool project, but you'd also have a new addition to the family.
Yeah, who knew?
Rob, thank you so much. I really appreciate it. And best of luck with all of your projects right now and the ones to come.
Thank you so much, Sarah. Take care.
Thank you for listening to Catalyze. I'm Sarah O'Carroll, and that was Rob Gourley from the class of 18. You can let us know what you thought of the episode by emailing us at communications@moreheadcain.org or by finding us on Twitter or Instagram at Morehead-Cain.